Shabbat shalom, everyone. Over the past few weeks, I've been thinking a lot about the life lessons that my mom taught me as I was growing up. In my family, we refer to these pearls of wisdom half lovingly and half sarcastically as motherly advice. I may have shared some now and again with you, but they're worthy of repeating. They range from small things like your sleeve is not a napkin, to somewhat larger things about how we process and encounter the world around us. The specific piece of motherly advice that I've been thinking about in recent weeks is the age-old debate of whether a glass is half full or half empty. Now, many of us identify with this metaphor, and we imagine ourselves embodying either a half full or a half empty glass, in that way that we look at life through that perspective. But the point, according to my mom, and I may have already let you in on the secret, is that it makes no difference whether the cup is half full or half empty. The point, she says, is that the glass is refillable. There will be times in life when our glasses begin to drain, but we have the power to fill them and empty them and fill them again and again. Now, this shift in perspective, I think, is critical. It's an acknowledgement of two very important things. First, that nothing is permanent. The glass will not forever be only full or only empty. It can and should and will inevitably change. And second, that while it may at times seem as though we are passive observers of the water level, that we're anything but passive, that it takes active participation in our own lives to refill the glass. They say that rabbis sometimes give the sermons that they themselves need to hear. And I'll be honest on this Shabbat and tell you that this is a sermon that I both need to give and the one that I need to hear. Because for the past couple of months in particular, I felt in many ways that the glass is half empty, and I haven't been in the director's chair as much as I would like to be. Over the past weeks, you see, I've been engaged in a great deal of advocacy work, praying with my feet, as Rabbi Heschel has taught us, and working to bring our Jewish values to life through sharing our stories and our sacred texts with our elected officials. In late January, I went with a group of our teens to Washington, D.C. as we joined hundreds of other Jewish teens from congregations around the country at the Religious Action Center's Litaken program. We learned about the intersection of Judaism with the laws and the policies that shape our nation. The teens then select topics of personal significance and work to craft speeches and lobby our Congress members and our senators. Or rather, they're supposed to lobby their Congress members and their senators. On this particular trip, though, our teens went to only one office, not the three that we had been anticipating. Out of 3 potential visits, we only went to Representative Don Bacon's office. Why, you might ask? Because his office was the only one to respond to repeated attempts for meeting requests. Neither of the other senators responded. It was deflating and it was frustrating to bring students all the way from Omaha to Washington, D.C., and not have our elected officials grant them meeting time to listen to their voices. Voices that we teach them are critical for them to use as they speak truth to power and demand and fight for the world that they want to live in. I came back home from that trip, and 2 days later, I drove to Lincoln to join Temple members in a fight for reproductive rights and abortion access, offering testimony in opposition to LB 626. We waited for hours, arriving before noon and not leaving that evening until after 8:30 p.m. to testify. And yet our representatives cut off testimony before the majority of the people who had come to Lincoln had a chance to speak. 1 week later, I was back in Lincoln again to join the fight for our trans youth, to offer testimony in opposition to LB 574, a bill that would deny essential gender-affirming care to transgender youth until age 19. And again, our representatives cut off testimony before most people spoke. Spending entire days in Lincoln fighting for bodily autonomy and the right to make healthcare decisions with families and physicians and faith leaders is draining, both physically and emotionally. It's exhausting, and it's uncomfortable to sit on the floor of the Capitol lobby or in a cramped, hot room waiting for a chance to speak. But more than anything, it's painful to hear the oftentimes horrific and traumatic stories that those brave souls who are giving testimony feel they have to share in order to help others understand why these laws are so deeply personal and why they would have such deeply significant impact in their lives. It's painful to hear doctors speak about how their ability to practice medicine and care for people would become compromised if these bills were to become laws. It's painful to hear the mental and emotional and spiritual anguish that people carry with them when they or their loved ones have been denied access to care when it was desperately, desperately needed. And it's painful that despite the hours and the physical and the emotional toll, that the bills continue to advance, and that in certain moments it feels as though the cup is half empty and that there is very little that I or anyone can do about it. But the cup is not empty. It is refillable. And it's my job, it's our jobs, to refill our own glasses. So in a world where it feels that the glass is half empty, how do I refill it? I look to the ways in my life that have been fortified and that I found joy and meaning and great significance in this work. I think about what it meant to take 4 teens, Zach, Renata, Mia, and Fiona, to Washington, D.C., and to teach them about why advocacy is a Jewish value. I think about the pride that I felt sitting in Representative Bacon's office as they shared why mental health education and reproductive choice were important to them. I think about the pride Renata and Zach themselves felt when they read their speeches and they taught the representative's chief of staff that Judaism teaches that government has an obligation to ensure that all people can access health care, including mental health care. In fact, they taught Maimonides, a Jewish scholar and physician, placed mental health care on his list of the 10 most important communal services that a city must offer residents if the city is to be worthy of having a scholar. I think about the pride that Jay and I felt as we listened to Fiona and Mia take what they learned from the conference and teach about Mishnah and its connective to reproductive choice. My glass is no longer half empty because I actively refill it. I think about the fact that I did not go to Lincoln to do this work alone. I went as part of a Temple Israel team. In Lincoln, over those 2 weeks, I stood with Wendy and Eileen and Megan and Joseph and Dan and John Carl and Noemi and Charlie and many, many more. And yes, we stood in line for hour after hour. And yes, we sat in hot, cramped rooms. And no, we didn't get to speak, but we did it together. We decided to raise our voices and remind our friends and neighbors and elected officials that our religious values are at stake in these conversations. We allowed Torah to become a living, breathing, sacred text that weaves into our lives in real and in deeply meaningful ways. My glass was refilled as I read our very own Noemi Gilbert's poignant and beautiful testimony in opposition to LB 574, in which they shared, "My religion teaches me that transgender young people are B'Tselem Elohim, made in the image of God, deserving of affirming spaces, schools, and people. Transgender young people," they wrote, "according to my religion, are radiant and brave in the gender we identify as, and we need our schools to recognize and validate and love us exactly as we are." And my glass overflows when I think about the text message that I received from Noemi, who on the 3rd trip down to Lincoln finally got to share these words in person. My glass refills when I think about the interfaith partnerships that I've developed through this process, partnerships that have grown stronger in these past few weeks than they have in the several years prior to this, because we keep showing up together to remind our communities that people of faith can and should speak out. I think about an ad that will be in the paper this weekend that will bring together voices of over 120 different clergy members and 14 different institutions from around the state, including all 4 tri-faith partners, which call for our friends and neighbors to connect with their elected officials and make their voices heard. Our cups are refillable. We have the power to refill them. Parshat Truma that Juliet just so beautifully read begins with God speaking to Moses, instructing him to tell the Israelites to bring me gifts. It says, "You shall accept gifts from me from every person whose heart is so moved." And then God proceeds to give a laundry list of what Moses should accept, a wide range of materials and items from gold and silver to yarn and linen to goat hair. Only after the list of items does God tell us what the items will be used for: to create a mishkan, a sanctuary in which God will dwell among the Israelites. It's curious that God tells Moses to gather the gifts before we even know what they're going to be used for. Usually it would be the other way around. And yet I think the order is important here. God isn't beginning a capital campaign based upon what we need with an end goal in mind, but instead celebrating the gifts that the Israelites already had with them. Wandering in the desert, they couldn't go out and find all of these materials. Rather, these are the items that came with them, that were part of their journey all along. They were part of the story, from slavery in Egypt, across the shores of the sea, into freedom and through the desert. These gifts of all kinds, gifts from every person whose heart is so moved, would be part of that celebration. These gifts would come together to create a dwelling place for God to be among the people, so that when the glass seems half empty, they would have the opportunity to look at the Mishkan, the place that God would dwell among them, constructed by the gifts of their own hearts, and they could refill their glasses. Because in 40 years of desert wandering, the glasses might seem a little bit empty every now and then, but they are always refillable. So too are our glasses, if only we change our perspective. Shabbat shalom.